A black boy saves a rich woman's dog, risking his own safety to pull it out of traffic. She thanks him, but barely spares him a second glance. The next morning, he's woken by police at his door, accusing him of stealing the very dog he rescued. What made her call the cops? And how will this shocking misunderstanding spark a journey neither of them could ever expect? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The late afternoon sun painted long shadows across the cracked sidewalks of Cedar Heights as Elijah Turner made his way home from Morgan's grocery. His arms ached from carrying 2 heavy paper bags filled with the week's essentials: bread, milk, pasta, and the small treats his mother occasionally allowed them to splurge on. The 16-year-old shifted the weight of the bags, careful not to tear them like last time. The familiar sights of his neighborhood surrounded him. Kids playing basketball in driveways, the Rodriguez family's wind chimes tinkling in the breeze, and old Mr. Peterson watering his prized roses. It wasn't fancy, but it was home. Suddenly, frantic barking pierced the peaceful scene. Elijah's head snapped up just in time to see a small dog dash into the intersection ahead, its leash trailing behind like a forgotten ribbon. Cars swerved and honked as the terrified animal zigzagged between them. Without thinking, Elijah dropped his grocery bags. Cans rolled across the sidewalk as he sprinted toward the chaos. His heart pounded in his chest as he dodged between 2 stopped cars. A blue sedan slammed on its brakes, missing him by inches. The driver shouted something, but Elijah was focused solely on reaching the frightened dog. "Here, boy, it's okay," he called out, his voice gentle despite his racing pulse. The small dog, trembling and panting, backed away from an approaching truck. Elijah lunged forward, managing to grab the trailing leash. He pulled the dog to safety, immediately kneeling beside the scared animal. "You're all right now," Elijah soothed, carefully untangling the leash from around the dog's legs. The little fellow responded to his calm tone, pressing against Elijah's leg. His soft fur was warm against Elijah's hand as he stroked the dog's head. "Nobody's going to hurt you." "Duke! Oh my goodness, Duke!" A woman's voice cut through the moment. Elijah looked up to see an elegantly dressed woman hurrying toward them in expensive-looking heels. Her gray hair was perfectly styled, and her clothes spoke of wealth that rarely ventured into this neighborhood. "Thank heavens," she said, slightly out of breath. She reached for the dog, who wagged his tail at her approach. "He just pulled away from me. I don't know what got into him." Elijah stood up, brushing off his jeans. "He was pretty scared, but he's okay now." The woman barely glanced at him as she checked Duke's collar. "Yes, well, thank you," she said distractedly, already turning away. "Come along, Duke." Elijah watched them go, his earlier adrenaline turning to irritation. He'd just risked his life to save her dog, and she couldn't even be bothered to ask his name or look him in the eye. Back at his scattered groceries, Elijah discovered the milk had burst open, creating a white puddle on the sidewalk. With a heavy sigh, he salvaged what he could and trudged the remaining blocks home. The familiar warmth of their small apartment greeted him as he pushed open the door. His mother, Danielle, looked up from her laptop where she'd been working on billing for her housekeeping clients. "What happened to you?" she asked, noting his disheveled appearance and the obviously lighter grocery bags. Elijah set the salvaged groceries on their tiny kitchen counter and recounted the story, his frustration growing as he described the woman's dismissive attitude. "I mean, would it have killed her to actually look at me? Or say more than 2 words?" He pulled out a slightly dented can of soup. "I ruined half our groceries saving her dog, and she acted like I was invisible." Danielle closed her laptop and gave her son a sympathetic smile. "Let it go, baby. Some people are just like that." "It's not right," Elijah insisted, shoving the surviving groceries into their designated spots with more force than necessary. Rich people think they can treat everyone else like we don't matter. The harsh banging on the front door jolted Elijah from his sleep. His heart raced as he stumbled out of bed, the morning sun barely peeking through his window blinds. The knocking continued, loud and insistent. "Coming!" He heard his mother call out, her footsteps hurrying across their small apartment. Elijah stepped into the hallway just as Danielle opened the door, revealing 2 police officers standing on their welcome mat. Their uniforms were crisp, their expressions stern. "Mrs. Turner?" the taller officer asked, consulting a small notepad. "I'm Officer Martinez, and this is Officer Chen. We're here about an incident involving your son yesterday afternoon." Danielle's spine straightened. "What incident?" "We received a report about a young man matching your son's description, attempting to steal a dog near the intersection of Maple and 4th, Officer Chen explained. "The witness described seeing him grab a small dog and try to run off with it." "What?" Elijah stepped forward, his voice cracking. "That's not what happened at all. I was helping that dog. It ran into traffic." Officer Martinez turned his attention to Elijah. "So you admit you were involved with the dog in question?" "Of course he admits it," Danielle interrupted, moving protectively in front of her son. "Because he has nothing to hide. My son was coming home from the grocery store when he saw a dog in danger and helped it. That's the kind of person he is." "Ma'am, we still need to investigate," Officer Chen began. "Investigate what exactly?" Danielle's voice was sharp. "Do you have any actual evidence besides some vague witness report? Did the dog's owner file a complaint?" "Well, no, but..." "Then why are you here harassing my son at 7 in the morning?" The confrontation was interrupted by the click of heels on concrete. Vivian Marshall hurried up the walkway, her face flushed with embarrassment. "Officers, please. There's been a terrible misunderstanding. Elijah Turner saved my dog, Duke. He's a hero, not a thief." The officers exchanged glances. Officer Martinez closed his notepad. "You're the dog's owner, ma'am." "Yes, and I should have spoken up immediately when I heard about this ridiculous accusation. Elijah risked his own safety to rescue Duke from traffic. I was distracted yesterday and didn't properly thank him." "I see," Officer Chen nodded. "Well, it appears this was indeed a misunderstanding. We apologize for the early morning disturbance." As the officers left, Vivian turned to Elijah and Danielle, her eyes pleading. "Elijah, I am so sorry. Please, I want to make this right." She reached into her designer purse and pulled out a small box. "I got you the latest smartphone as a thank you and an apology." "No." Elijah's voice was cold. "I don't want your guilt money." "Please, I feel terrible about..." "Just stop." Elijah grabbed the door handle. "You didn't even bother to learn my name yesterday, but now you're trying to buy my forgiveness?" He slammed the door in her face, cutting off her response. Collapsing into a kitchen chair, Elijah buried his face in his hands. The morning's humiliation weighed heavy on his shoulders. He felt his mother's gentle hand on his back, rubbing small circles like she used to do when he was little. In her sprawling Victorian mansion, Vivian Marshall sat in her leather armchair, watching the evening shadows creep across her Persian rug. Duke dozed peacefully at her feet, his small chest rising and falling with each breath. The events of the morning played through her mind like a film she couldn't stop. The shocked faces, the hurt in Elijah's eyes, the fierce protection of his mother. "Oh, Duke," she whispered, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. "What a mess I've made of things." Her fingers trembled as she pulled out her finest stationery from the antique desk drawer. The cream-colored paper felt heavy in her hands as she began to write. "Dear Elijah, I cannot express how deeply sorry I am for this morning's terrible misunderstanding. Your heroic actions saved Duke's life, and instead of proper gratitude, you received accusations and embarrassment. I was wrong to dismiss you so quickly yesterday, and I failed to correct the situation before it escalated. I would very much like to make this right. Would you consider visiting my home this Saturday afternoon? I have something I'd like to discuss with you, and I promise it will be worth your time. My address is 1542 Oakwood Drive. With sincere apologies and gratitude, Vivian Marshall. The sun had nearly set when Vivian drove through Elijah's neighborhood. She parked her Mercedes a block away and walked to his building, the note clutched in her hand. At his door, she hesitated before carefully placing the envelope on the welcome mat. Later that evening, Danielle's warm voice filled the Turners' small kitchen as she read the note aloud. Elijah leaned against the counter, arms crossed, his expression skeptical. "She seems genuinely sorry," Danielle said softly, looking up at her son. "Sometimes people surprise us, baby. Maybe this is her way of trying to make things right." "Or maybe she just feels guilty," Elijah muttered, but his voice held less anger than before. "That's not always a bad thing," Danielle replied, setting the note down. "Guilt can lead to growth, to better choices, and you never know what opportunities might come from giving someone a second chance." Elijah uncrossed his arms, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "You really think I should go?" "I think you should consider it," Danielle said, reaching out to squeeze his hand. "What's the worst that could happen? You already know you don't like her." A small smile tugged at the corner of Elijah's mouth. "Fine," he sighed. "I'll think about it." He picked up the note from the table and walked to his room, closing the door behind him. Sitting at his desk, he stared at his notebook, pages filled with half-finished stories and character sketches. The invitation sat beside it, Vivian's elegant handwriting catching the light from his desk lamp. Elijah stood at the ornate iron gates of Vivian Marshall's estate, his hands stuffed deep in his pockets. The afternoon sun made the polished metal gleam, and he squinted at the security camera mounted above. With a soft mechanical whir, the gates began to part. "Well, here goes nothing," he muttered, taking his first tentative steps onto the cobblestone driveway. Perfectly manicured lawns stretched out on either side, dotted with flowering shrubs and ancient oak trees. The mansion loomed ahead, its Victorian architecture both impressive and intimidating. The front door opened before he reached it, and Vivian emerged wearing a simple blue dress that probably cost more than his mom's monthly rent. Her smile seemed genuine, but Elijah kept his expression neutral. "Thank you for coming, Elijah," she said softly. A familiar bark interrupted any response he might have made. Duke came bounding out the door, his tail wagging furiously as he rushed to greet Elijah. "Hey there, buddy," Elijah said, his guard dropping slightly as he knelt to pet the excited dog. Duke licked his hand and spun in happy circles. "He remembers you," Vivian observed. "Would you like to see the house?" Elijah nodded stiffly, following her through the grand entrance hall. Their footsteps echoed on the marble floors as she led him past room filled with antiques and artwork. He tried not to stare, but it was like walking through a museum. The tension in his shoulders eased slightly when they reached the library. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined every wall, filled with leather-bound volumes and first editions. A rolling ladder stood ready to reach the highest shelves, and comfortable reading chairs were arranged near large windows that flooded the room with natural light. "This was Alexander's sanctuary," Vivian explained, her voice softening at the mention of her late husband. "He collected books his entire life." Elijah's fingers itched to explore the shelves, but he kept his hands firmly at his sides. Duke trotted between them, providing welcome breaks in the awkward silence that followed. Do you enjoy reading? Vivian asked, attempting to restart the conversation. Yes, Elijah replied simply, though his eyes betrayed his interest as they scanned the titles. Vivian seemed to want to say more but held back, respecting his reserved demeanor. They completed the tour with minimal conversation, Duke's occasional playful barks the only sound breaking the quiet. As the visit drew to a close, Vivian hesitantly offered him a book she'd noticed him eyeing, a rare collection of short stories. Elijah accepted it carefully, unable to completely hide his appreciation for the volume. He left the estate with the borrowed book tucked under his arm, Duke watching his departure from the front step, tail still wagging hopefully. The gates closed behind him with the same mechanical whir that had welcomed him, leaving him to sort through his mixed feelings about the afternoon. The gates opened smoothly as Elijah approached Vivian's estate on Friday afternoon. The sun warmed his back, and a gentle breeze rustled through the oak trees lining the driveway. Duke's excited barking echoed across the grounds before Elijah even reached the front door. "Someone's happy to see you," Vivian said, emerging onto the wraparound porch. She held Duke's leather leash in her hand, and the small dog practically danced with excitement at Elijah's feet. "Hey there, Duke." Elijah couldn't help but smile as he scratched behind the dog's ears. The tension in his shoulders eased slightly. "Would you mind taking him for his afternoon walk?" Vivian asked, holding out the leash. "He's been restless all day." Elijah nodded, accepting the leash. Duke immediately tugged him toward a winding path that led through the gardens. The path was bordered by late summer flowers, their colors vivid against the green lawns. As they walked, Duke sniffed enthusiastically at every bush and flower bed. After about 15 minutes, Vivian's footsteps crunched on the gravel behind them. "This was Thomas's favorite spot," she said softly, gesturing to a wooden bench beneath an old maple tree. "He'd sit here for hours with Duke, reading or just watching the sunset." Something in her voice made Elijah turn. The usual polish in Vivian's manner had cracked slightly, revealing a glimpse of genuine emotion. "Duke was Thomas's birthday gift to himself," she continued, smiling at the memory. "He'd always wanted a dog, but his work kept him too busy. When he finally retired..." She trailed off, watching Duke chase a butterfly. "What kind of work did he do?" Elijah asked, surprising himself with his curiosity. "He was a publisher, actually." Vivian glanced at him. "I noticed you writing in a notebook yesterday. Do you enjoy writing?" Elijah shifted his weight, suddenly self-conscious. "Yeah, I guess, just stories and stuff." "What kind of stories?" "Different things. Mostly about people dealing with real-life problems." He paused, then added, "My English teacher says I have a good voice, whatever that means." "It means you have a unique way of telling stories," Vivian explained, her eyes lighting up with interest. "That's quite a gift, you know." Duke tugged at the leash, ready to continue their walk. As they followed the path back toward the house, Elijah found himself sharing more about his writing, his classes, and even a little about his mom's job at the hospital. Vivian listened intently, asking thoughtful questions that showed she was genuinely interested in his answers. When they reached the front door, Vivian disappeared briefly into the library and returned with a worn copy of a classic novel. "I thought you might enjoy this one," she said, holding it out. Elijah took the book, running his fingers over the well-loved spine. "Thanks," he said, and meant it. For the first time since their awkward first meeting, he felt like maybe there was more to Vivian Marshall than he'd initially thought. Saturday morning brought a crisp autumn breeze to Vivian's estate. As Elijah walked up the driveway, he heard frantic shouting mixed with laughter coming from the garden. Rounding the corner, he found a comical scene unfolding. Duke was racing through Vivian's prized rose garden, dirt flying everywhere as he enthusiastically dug holes between the carefully tended bushes. Vivian, usually so composed, was chasing after him with soil-stained gardening gloves, her designer pants covered in muddy paw prints. "Duke, no, not the white roses," Vivian called out, but there was more amusement than anger in her voice. The small dog looked up at her with dirt-covered paws and what could only be described as a mischievous grin before darting away again. When Duke spotted Elijah, he bounded toward him, leaving a trail of scattered petals in his wake. Elijah crouched down and caught the excited pup, wrapping his arms around the squirming bundle of energy. "Got you, troublemaker," Elijah said, scratching Duke's ears. The dog immediately calmed under his touch, panting happily. Vivian approached, brushing dirt from her clothes while laughing. "He's been impossible this morning. I think the cooler weather has him extra energetic." "Dogs will be dogs," Elijah said, smiling despite himself. The morning's chaos had broken through some of his usual reserve. "I've been working on a new story," he found himself saying, surprising himself with the admission. "It's about a dog, actually." "Really?" Vivian's eyes lit up with interest. "I'd love to read it sometime. You know, my husband always said that good writing comes from discipline and dedication. He learned that from his father. Strict upbringing, but it made him successful. Early mornings, rigid schedules, that sort of thing." Elijah's smile faded slightly. "Yeah, well, it's not that simple when you're trying to write between school and helping your mom with bills." "Oh, but that's exactly what I mean," Vivian continued, missing the shift in his tone. "Hard work and proper structure can overcome any obstacle. My husband started with nothing and built himself up through sheer determination." Elijah nodded politely, but his jaw tightened. The weight of Duke in his arms suddenly felt heavy. Here was Vivian, standing in her $1,000 gardening outfit, telling him about overcoming obstacles while surrounded by wealth that most people couldn't imagine. "I should probably get going," he said, carefully setting Duke down. "I have homework to finish." "Of course, dear. Think about what I said about discipline. It really is the key to success." As Elijah walked toward the gate, Duke whined softly at his departure. He felt torn, grateful that Vivian wanted to read his work, but irritated by her well-meaning but tone-deaf advice. She clearly didn't understand what it was like to struggle with real-world problems, not just self-imposed challenges. Monday afternoon sunlight streamed through Elijah's bedroom window, casting a warm glow on the papers scattered across his desk. He hunched over his notebook, crossing out words and scribbling new ones in the margins of his latest short story. The sound of his pencil scratching against paper filled the quiet room. Danielle appeared in the doorway, carrying a glass of lemonade. She watched her son for a moment, noting the intense concentration on his face. "How's the writing going, honey?" she asked, placing the glass on his desk. Elijah looked up, running a hand through his hair. "It's complicated." He gestured at the marked-up pages. "Just like everything else with Vivian." Danielle pulled up a chair beside him. "Want to talk about it?" "She's nice enough, I guess," Elijah said, fiddling with his pencil. "And that library of hers is amazing. But sometimes she says things—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "What kind of things?" Like yesterday, she was talking about her husband's childhood and how strict discipline made him successful, as if that's all it takes. Elijah's voice carried a hint of frustration. "She has no idea what it's like for people like us." Danielle nodded thoughtfully. "You're right. She probably doesn't understand our experiences. But people can learn, Elijah. Sometimes they just need time and a chance to see things differently." "I don't know, Mom," Elijah sighed, glancing at his story. "What if she just doesn't get it?" "Trust is like building a bridge," Danielle said softly. "It happens one piece at a time. You don't have to share everything at once, but maybe sharing something small could be a start." Elijah picked up his story, scanning the pages. After a long moment, he stood up. I think I'm going to show her this." Later that evening, Elijah stood in Vivian's library, his hands trembling slightly as he held out the stack of papers. "It's not finished yet," he said quickly, "and it probably needs more work." Vivian took the pages carefully, as if handling something precious. "Thank you for sharing this with me, Elijah," she said, her voice gentle. "I promise to read it very carefully." As she left the room with his story, Elijah watched her go, his heart pounding. In those pages were pieces of himself, his thoughts, his experiences, things he rarely shared with anyone. He could only hope she would understand what he was trying to say. The setting sun painted long shadows across Vivian's driveway as Elijah approached the front door, his notebook clutched tightly against his chest. His heart raced with a mix of excitement and nervousness about hearing Vivian's thoughts on his story. Duke's familiar barking greeted him before Vivian opened the door, her silver hair neatly styled and her smile warm but thoughtful. "Elijah, please come in," she said, gesturing toward the library. "I've been looking forward to discussing your story." They settled into the comfortable leather chairs by the window. Vivian held Elijah's marked-up manuscript in her hands, sticky notes peeking out from between the pages. "Your writing is remarkable," she began, her voice sincere. "The way you captured the main character's struggle with his father's expectations, it's powerful stuff, raw and honest." Elijah felt his chest swell with pride, but tried to keep his expression neutral. "Thank you," he said quietly. "The emotion really comes through," Vivian continued, flipping through the pages, "especially in the scene where he's working late at night, trying to prove himself." Just as Elijah started to relax, Vivian added, "Though you know, sometimes kids need tough love to reach their full potential. My husband always said that struggle builds character." The words hit Elijah like a slap. His hands clenched into fists as all his bottled-up frustrations burst forth. "Tough love?" he spat out. "Is that what you call it? You have no idea what it's like?" Vivian's eyes widened in surprise. "I didn't mean—" "No, you didn't mean anything because you don't understand." Elijah stood up, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "You sit here in your fancy house, making judgments about things you know nothing about. This story isn't just fiction. It's real life for some of us." "Elijah, please." Vivian reached out, but he was already backing away. "You think throwing money at problems fixes everything, but you don't get it. You don't get me." He snatched his notebook from the table, tears stinging his eyes. "This was a mistake." He stormed out of the library, ignoring Vivian's calls behind him. Duke whined at the commotion, but Elijah didn't stop. He pushed through the front door and out into the evening air, his footsteps heavy on the gravel driveway. The sky had darkened to deep purple, and a cool breeze ruffled the pages of his notebook as he walked home. His anger gradually melted into a hollow ache in his chest. Maybe he'd been foolish to think someone like Vivian could ever truly understand his world. The table lamp cast a soft glow across Vivian's mahogany desk as she spread out the pages of Elijah's story once more. Duke shifted at her feet, his gentle snoring a comforting backdrop to her troubled thoughts. Her fingers traced the words on the page, seeing them with new eyes after their heated exchange earlier that day. "Oh, Duke," she whispered, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. "I really messed up, didn't I?" The story's protagonist, a young boy struggling to pursue his dreams despite financial hardships, reminded her so much of Elijah. How could she have been so callous with that tough love comment? Her cheeks burned with shame as she remembered the hurt in his eyes. Vivian pulled out her personalized stationery and began to write, her elegant handwriting slightly shaky with emotion. "Dear Elijah, I've spent the evening rereading your story, and I owe you an apology. My comment about tough love was thoughtless and came from a place of privilege I'm only now beginning to recognize. Your story opened my eyes to experiences so different from my own, and instead of listening and learning, I responded with judgment. Your writing showed me a world I've never truly understood. The daily struggles, the weight of expectations, the courage it takes to keep dreaming, you captured it all beautifully. I realize now that I've been viewing everything through the lens of my own privileged upbringing, and that needs to change. I'm sorry for diminishing your experiences. You deserve better, and I hope you'll give me another chance to learn and understand. She signed the letter and sealed it in an envelope, checking the clock. Past midnight. Duke lifted his head, watching as she gathered her things. The next morning, Vivian drove through Elijah's neighborhood just as the sun was rising. Her Mercedes felt conspicuously out of place among the modest apartment buildings. She parked across the street from Elijah's building and walked to his mailbox, letter in hand. Standing before the row of metal mailboxes, she hesitated. Would he even read it? Had she ruined any chance of connecting with this talented young writer? Taking a deep breath, she slipped the envelope through the slot. Back in her car, Vivian gazed up at Elijah's apartment window. The curtains were drawn, the household likely still asleep. She gripped her steering wheel, hoping her words would somehow bridge the gap between their worlds. Danielle shuffled through the stack of mail as she climbed the stairs to their third-floor apartment. Bills, advertisements, and then her eyes caught on the cream-colored envelope with Elijah's name written in elegant script. She recognized the return address immediately. Inside their apartment, she found Elijah at the kitchen table, homework spread out before him. "There's a letter for you," she said softly, holding up the envelope. "It's from Vivian." Elijah's shoulders tensed. "I don't want to read it." "Would you let me read it to you?" Danielle pulled out a chair next to him. "Sometimes it helps to hear difficult things through someone else's voice." After a long moment, Elijah nodded, though his arms remained firmly crossed over his chest. Danielle opened the envelope carefully and began to read. "Dear Elijah, I've spent the evening rereading your story, and I owe you an apology. My comment about tough love was thoughtless and came from a place of privilege I'm only now beginning to recognize." As she read, Elijah's expression shifted subtly. His crossed arms loosened slightly, though his jaw remained tight. "She seems truly sorry," Danielle said when she finished reading. "You know, this reminds me of something that happened to me years ago, before you were born." Elijah turned to face her, curiosity breaking through his guard. "My first boss at the bank, she was a lot like Vivian. Wealthy, sometimes tone-deaf, about what life was like for the rest of us. One day, she said something that hurt me deeply about people who don't apply themselves. I was ready to quit." "What happened?" Elijah asked quietly. "I almost did quit, but instead, I decided to tell her how her words made me feel. And you know what? She listened, really listened. That woman ended up being one of my greatest mentors, and she helped me get my first promotion." Elijah uncrossed his arms, running his fingers along the edge of the letter. "But what if I give her another chance, and she just hurts me again?" "That's always a risk when we open ourselves up to people," Danielle admitted. "But sometimes the biggest growth comes from the hardest conversations. And from what I can see, Vivian is trying to grow." Elijah picked up the letter, reading portions of it again to himself. His expression softened slightly as he considered his mother's words. Finally, he placed the letter on his desk and whispered, "Maybe one more chance." The morning sun cast long shadows across Vivian's manicured lawn as Elijah made his way up the familiar driveway, his sneakers crunching softly against the gravel. His notebook felt heavy under his arm, like it carried more than just paper and words. It held his dreams, his fears, and now, his uncertainty. Duke's excited barking pierced the morning quiet, growing louder with each step Elijah took. The dog's joy a stark contrast to the weight in his chest. Vivian emerged from the front door, wearing a simple blue sweater instead of her usual polished attire, her hair pulled back in a casual ponytail. Her hands fidgeted with her sleeve as she watched him approach, twisting the soft fabric between her fingers. The nervousness in her expression matched the butterflies in Elijah's stomach, both of them clearly unsure how to bridge the gap that had formed. "Thank you for coming," Vivian said softly, her voice carrying a hint of relief. Duke bounded past her, circling Elijah's legs with enthusiastic greetings, his tail wagging furiously. "I need to say something in person." She took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. "I was wrong, Elijah. Not just about what I said, but about thinking I understood your experiences when I clearly don't." Elijah nodded slowly, appreciating the directness of her words, while his fingers traced the edge of his notebook. "I'm not looking for pity," he said firmly, meeting her gaze, "and I won't pretend everything's okay just because you apologized." "I understand," Vivian replied, her eyes sincere. "Trust needs to be earned. I want to learn and do better, but I'll follow your lead." They settled on the porch steps, Duke flopping contentedly between them, his warm presence a familiar comfort. Vivian gestured to his notebook, her movements careful and deliberate. "Would you tell me more about your story? The part about the main character's relationship with his teacher? It felt so real." "It was real," Elijah admitted, running his hand along the notebook's worn cover, feeling every crease and fold. "That teacher believed in me when nobody else did. She saw something in my writing that I couldn't see myself, but she moved away last year." "That loss comes through in your writing," Vivian said thoughtfully, her voice gentle. "The way you described it. I could feel his sense of abandonment. The words carried such weight." For the first time in days, Elijah felt his guard lowering slightly, like a wall crumbling brick by brick. They talked about his story, really talked, with Vivian asking questions that showed she'd paid attention to the details, the emotions beneath the words. Her genuine interest sparked something in him, a cautious hope. As they walked Duke around the garden later, the morning air had warmed, the sun climbing higher in the sky. The tension between them hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had shifted into something different, something that felt more like understanding, a fragile bridge beginning to form between their two worlds. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the heavy curtains of John Marshall's study, casting a warm glow on the leather-bound books that lined the walls. Elijah stepped into the room cautiously, taking in the rich mahogany desk and the vintage reading lamps. His eyes were drawn to the black and white photographs arranged carefully on the walls, snapshots of a man's life from boyhood to his final years. "That's John," Vivian said softly, picking up a leather-bound journal from the desk. "He wrote in these every day for 30 years. Her fingers traced the worn edges with care. "I think you might find this interesting." She opened the journal to a marked page and handed it to Elijah. He settled into one of the deep leather chairs and began to read aloud. "Success demands sacrifice. Father taught me that nothing worth having comes easily. Pain builds character." Elijah looked up at Vivian, his expression thoughtful. "My mom has a different view," he said. "She believes in working hard too, but she says encouragement builds more character than punishment ever could." Vivian nodded slowly, sitting across from him. John's father was extremely strict. It shaped how John saw the world, and I suppose it shaped how I saw it too. She paused, looking at a photo of her late husband as a young boy, standing stiffly beside a stern-faced man. "But watching you with your mother, seeing how her support has helped you grow. It's made me question a lot of what I thought I knew. Mom works 2 jobs, Elijah shared, but she still finds time to read my stories and tell me I can do anything I set my mind to. That means more than any tough love ever could. I'm beginning to understand that, Vivian replied softly. John's journal entries about discipline and success. They're inspiring in their way, but they miss something crucial. The kind of strength that comes from knowing someone believes in you. As they talked, the afternoon light shifted across the room. Vivian shared more stories about John, and Elijah opened up about his mother's sacrifices. Their words bridged the gap between their different worlds, building understanding with each shared perspective. Before Elijah left, Vivian carefully removed a page from John's journal, one about perseverance and dreams, and handed it to him. He tucked it into his notebook with care, feeling the weight of trust in the gesture. As he walked down the driveway, Vivian stood in the doorway, grateful for the lessons she was learning from this unexpected friendship. The afternoon sun cast dappled shadows through the park's maple trees as Elijah, Jordan, and Malik tossed a football between them. Their laughter echoed across the worn basketball court where they'd spent countless afternoons together since middle school. So, Jordan said, spinning the football in his hands, heard you've been hanging out at that fancy estate up on Hill Street. His tone carried a hint of mockery that made Elijah's stomach tighten. Yeah, what about it? Elijah caught the ball Jordan threw, perhaps a bit harder than necessary. Malik leaned against a nearby bench. We're just wondering what's up with that. I mean, that's not exactly our usual crowd, you know? Mrs. Marshall's been helping me with my writing, Elijah explained, trying to keep his voice neutral. She's got this amazing library and... Oh, the amazing library! Jordan interrupted with an exaggerated posh accent. Look at you, becoming their little charity case. He smirked, but his eyes held something darker, something that looked like hurt. It's not like that, Elijah protested, the football now forgotten in his hands. She's actually helping me improve. She sees potential in my work. Potential? Jordan scoffed. More like she's trying to turn you into one of them. Next thing we know, you'll be too good to hang out with us regular folks. No, Alex shifted uncomfortably. Jordan, come on, man. No, I'm serious, Jordan continued. Ever since you started going there, you've been different, acting all proper and stuff. That's not fair, Elijah said, his voice rising. Just because I'm trying to better myself doesn't mean I'm changing who I am. Better yourself? Jordan stepped closer. What's wrong with who you are now? What's wrong with where you come from? The words hit Elijah like a physical blow. Nothing's wrong with where I come from, but that doesn't mean I can't want more for myself. Whatever, man, Jordan waved dismissively. Have fun with your new rich friend. Just don't forget about us little people when you're living the high life. Elijah looked at Malek, hoping for support, but his friend just stared at the ground, clearly uncomfortable with the whole situation. The silence felt heavy, loaded with unspoken accusations. You know what? I don't need this, Elijah said quietly, dropping the football. He turned and walked away, ignoring Jordan's taunting calls behind him. When he got home, Danielle took one look at his face and knew something was wrong. She sat with him at their small kitchen table, listening as he explained what happened. Baby, she said softly, sometimes the hardest part of growing isn't the change itself. It's dealing with how others react to that change. Elijah slumped in his chair. They think I'm betraying who I am. No, Danielle squeezed his hand. You're adding to who you are. There's a difference. Don't let anyone make you feel bad about wanting to grow. Later, sitting at his desk, Elijah opened his notebook. His pen hovered over the blank page for a moment before he began writing, pouring his feelings about loyalty, growth, and change onto the paper. Duke's excited barking echoed across the manicured lawn as Elijah pushed open the heavy iron gate. The small dog bounded toward him, tail wagging furiously, and jumped up to plant his paws on Elijah's legs. "Hey, buddy," Elijah said softly, scratching behind Duke's ears. The dog's unconditional affection brought a small smile to his face, despite the heaviness in his chest. Vivian emerged from the house, her face brightening at the sight of Elijah. But her expression shifted as she noticed the subtle slump of his shoulders and the distant look in his eyes. "Something's troubling you," she said gently, gesturing toward the garden bench. "Would you like to talk about it?" Elijah hesitated, following her to the bench while Duke trotted alongside them. The morning sun warmed his face as he sat down, fingers absently stroking Duke's soft fur. "I got into an argument with my friends," he finally admitted, his voice quiet. "They don't understand why I keep coming here. Jordan called me a charity case, and Malik thinks I'm forgetting where I came from." Vivian listened intently, her hands folded in her lap. When Elijah finished speaking, she was quiet for a moment before responding. "You know," she began, "I lost some dear friends years ago when I married John. They thought I was choosing wealth over our friendship, that I'd become someone different." She shook her head slightly. "It took me a long time to understand that growth doesn't mean betrayal." Duke suddenly pushed his wet nose against Elijah's hand, demanding attention. The unexpected interruption made both of them laugh, breaking the tension. "Some relationships evolve with us," Vivian continued, watching Duke's antics. "Others might need time to adjust. I learned that rebuilding trust, or accepting that some distances can't be bridged, takes patience." Elijah nodded slowly, feeling the knot in his chest loosen slightly. "It's just hard when people you care about don't see what you're trying to do." "I understand," Vivian said softly. "But you're not betraying your roots by expanding your horizons. You're adding to who you are, not subtracting from it." Duke flopped onto his back between them, panting happily and making them both chuckle again. Vivian stood and walked to a nearby shelf, returning with a leather-bound book. "Here," she said, handing it to Elijah. "I think you'll find this interesting. And Elijah, keep writing. Your voice, your unique perspective, matters more than you know." The evening sun cast long shadows across Vivian's estate as Elijah approached the front gate. Something felt different tonight. The usual peaceful atmosphere was replaced by a heavy tension. As he drew closer, he spotted Vivian pacing back and forth on her front porch, wringing her hands. "Elijah, thank goodness you're here," she called out, her voice trembling. "It's Duke. Something's wrong." Inside, Duke lay curled up on his plush bed, his usual playful energy completely gone. His eyes were glazed, and he barely lifted his head when Elijah knelt beside him. "He won't eat or drink," Vivian explained, her composure cracking. "And he's been like this all day." Elijah gently stroked Duke's head, noting how warm he felt. "We need to get him to a vet," he said firmly. Vivian nodded, already reaching for her car keys with shaking hands. "There's an emergency clinic across town." Together, they carefully lifted Duke into Vivian's car. The drive was tense and silent, broken only by Duke's occasional whimpers. Elijah kept his hand on Duke's back, offering what comfort he could. At the clinic, a gentle-voiced veterinarian examined Duke thoroughly, while Vivian and Elijah waited anxiously. When she finally emerged from the examination room, her smile brought immediate relief. "Duke has a bacterial infection," she explained. "It's completely treatable with antibiotics. He'll need rest and medication for the next week, but he should make a full recovery." The drive back to the estate felt lighter, though Duke dozed in the back seat, still under the weather. Vivian gripped the steering wheel, then glanced at Elijah. "Thank you," she said softly, "for being here tonight. I don't handle these things well on my own anymore. Not since John." "You don't have to," Elijah replied, surprising himself with the words. "I care about Duke, too. You're not alone in this." Back at the estate, they settled Duke into his bed. Elijah sat beside him, gently running his fingers through the dog's fur. Duke's breathing had steadied, and he seemed more peaceful now. Vivian stood in the doorway, watching them both with grateful eyes. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows of Vivian's estate as she opened the front door, her face beaming with excitement. In her hand, she clutched a bright yellow flyer that seemed to capture her enthusiasm. "Elijah, look at this!" She waved the paper eagerly. "The National Young Writers Competition. The grand prize includes publication and a scholarship." Elijah took the flyer, his eyes scanning the details. His heart raced at the words prestigious and nationally recognized, but a familiar weight of doubt settled in his stomach. "I don't know, Vivian," he said, shifting uncomfortably. "These contests attract the best young writers from across the country. My writing isn't—" "Stop right there," Vivian interrupted, her voice gentle but firm. "Your writing has depth, heart, and authenticity. Those are things that can't be taught." They settled into the library, where Duke dozed peacefully by the fireplace. Vivian pulled out a notebook and pen, ready to brainstorm. "John always said the best stories come from what we know," she explained, mentioning her late husband. "He believed in finding the extraordinary in ordinary moments." For the next few hours, they explored different story ideas. Elijah shared experiences from his neighborhood, memories of his mother's sacrifices, and the daily struggles he observed. Vivian listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes and asking questions that helped him dig deeper into each concept. "Remember," she advised, "show your readers the world through your eyes. Make them feel what you feel." As the afternoon progressed, Elijah's initial reluctance gave way to growing excitement. Ideas flowed more freely, and he found himself reaching for his notebook more frequently to capture sudden inspirations. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I think I might have something worth writing about." Vivian smiled warmly. "Of course you do. You always did." When evening approached, Elijah gathered his notes and the contest flyer. Back home, he carefully pinned the bright yellow paper above his desk, smoothing out the corners. Opening his notebook to a fresh page, he began outlining his story, his pen moving with newfound purpose across the paper. The kitchen light cast a warm glow as Elijah sat at the worn wooden table, his story pages trembling slightly in his hands. Danielle leaned forward, her elbows resting on the table, her face soft with attention. The quiet hum of their refrigerator provided a gentle backdrop to Elijah's voice as he began reading. "The distance between stars," he started, his voice growing steadier with each word. The story flowed from his lips, a tale of two unlikely friends bridging vast differences through understanding and compassion. Danielle's eyes never left her son's face as he read. She nodded at particularly moving passages, her smile growing wider at clever turns of phrase. When Elijah described a character's struggle to be understood, her eyes grew misty. As the final words hung in the air, Danielle reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "Baby, that was beautiful," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've always had talent, but this shows how much you've grown." Elijah ducked his head, but couldn't hide his smile. "You really think it's good enough?" "More than good enough," Danielle assured him. "I see so much of you in these words, but I also see how much you've learned from everything that's happened with Vivian." Elijah nodded thoughtfully. It's weird, isn't it? How someone who seemed so different could end up teaching me so much about writing and about myself. Sometimes the best teachers come from unexpected places, Danielle said softly. They spent the next few hours at that kitchen table. Elijah polished his prose while Danielle made suggestions here and there. When it came time to write the cover letter, she helped him find the right words to introduce himself to the judges. The next morning, Elijah stood at the mailbox, his submission packet sealed and ready. His hand lingered on the envelope for a moment before he slipped it inside and raised the red flag. As he watched it stand tall against the morning sky, he whispered, "This could be the start of something great." The morning sun streamed through Elijah's bedroom window, waking him earlier than usual. His stomach churned with anticipation about the contest results, and no amount of tossing and turning could quiet his racing thoughts. The sheets felt tangled and uncomfortable against his restless legs. When his phone buzzed with a message from Vivian inviting him to help organize the library, he welcomed the distraction like a lifeline. At the estate, towering shelves of books surrounded them, their leather spines gleaming in the soft light. The air carried the rich, comforting scent of aged paper and wood polish. Duke curled up in a patch of sunlight near the window as Elijah and Vivian began sorting through countless volumes, their footsteps echoing softly on the hardwood floors. "John always said books were like time machines," Vivian said, carefully dusting off an old collection of poetry, her fingers tracing the gold-leafed edges with reverence. "He believed every story had the power to change someone's life." Elijah ran his fingers along the spine of a first-edition novel, feeling the subtle texture of the aged leather. He must have spent years building this collection. "Decades," Vivian smiled, passing him another stack. "He wanted to create something lasting, you know, a place where knowledge and stories could be passed down. He dreamed of making this library a sanctuary for future generations." They worked steadily through the morning, trading stories and occasional laughter. Vivian shared tales of John's passionate hunt for rare books, including one particularly amusing adventure involving a wild goose chase through 3 different countries. Elijah opened up about his earliest memories of writing stories on notebook paper, describing how he used to scribble tales during math class. Around noon, Elijah's phone buzzed again. His heart skipped a beat as he read the message from the contest organizers, his hands trembling slightly. "They're announcing the results next week," he said, his voice tight with anxiety. Vivian set down the book she was holding and looked at him thoughtfully, her expression warm and understanding. "You know, Elijah, the real victory isn't in winning or losing. It's in having the courage to put your work out there, to let your voice be heard." "I know, but..." Elijah hesitated, fidgeting with the corner of a nearby book. "But you still want to win," Vivian finished, understanding in her eyes. "That's natural. Just remember that no matter what happens, you've already grown so much as a writer. I've seen it firsthand in the way you approach your craft." Her words settled something in Elijah's chest, easing the knot of worry that had been building there. They returned to their work, the peaceful rhythm of sorting books providing a gentle balance to his earlier anxiety. Duke occasionally trotted over to check on them, his tail wagging contentedly. When Elijah finally returned home that evening, he felt calmer than he had in days. The setting sun cast long shadows across his bedroom as he sat at his desk, thumbing through his well-worn notebook filled with story ideas and half-finished drafts. The familiar smell of paper and ink brought a smile to his face, and for the first time that day, he felt truly at peace. Elijah walked down the familiar streets of his neighborhood, the afternoon sun warming his shoulders. His notebook felt comfortable in his hands as he paused occasionally to scribble down thoughts and story ideas. The past few weeks had changed him in ways he never expected. and he found himself viewing his surroundings with new eyes. The rhythmic bounce of a basketball caught his attention. Looking up, he spotted Jordan and Malik at the local court, engaged in a casual game of one-on-one. His steps slowed, and his grip tightened on his notebook. After their last argument, he wasn't sure where they stood. Jordan noticed him first, catching the ball mid-dribble. "Hey, E!" he called out, his voice carrying a hint of uncertainty. Elijah hesitated before walking toward them. "Hey, guys." Malik wiped sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. "We were just talking about you, actually." "Look, man," Jordan started, spinning the basketball nervously in his hands. "What I said before, about you being a charity case, that wasn't cool. I was being stupid." "Yeah," Malik chimed in. "We were both kind of jealous, you know? Seeing you getting these opportunities." Elijah leaned against the chain-link fence. "I'm still me, guys. That hasn't changed." "We know that now," Jordan said, looking genuinely remorseful. "It's just, everything's changing so fast, and we were scared of losing our friend." "I'm not going anywhere," Elijah assured them. "Working with Vivian is helping me grow as a writer, but that doesn't mean I'm leaving my life behind." He gestured to the neighborhood around them. "This is still my home. You guys are still my friends." Malik nodded slowly. "We get it now. And honestly, it's pretty cool what you're doing, following your dreams and all that." "Yeah," Jordan agreed, bouncing the ball once. "Maybe we could, I don't know, hear some of your stories sometime?" A smile spread across Elijah's face. "I'd like that." They bumped fists, the familiar gesture carrying new weight. The tension that had been building between them dissolved in the warm afternoon air, replaced by understanding and renewed friendship. "So," Malik grinned, "you want in on this game?" Elijah tucked his notebook safely in his back pocket. "You know I'm always ready to school you both." Elijah's fingers drummed nervously against the kitchen table as he refreshed his email for what felt like the 100th time that morning. Danielle stood behind him, her hands resting gently on his shoulders. "Breathe, honey," she said softly. "Refreshing it every few seconds won't make the email arrive any faster." "I know, Mom," Elijah sighed, but his finger still hovered over the refresh button. "I just can't stop thinking about it." Suddenly, a new message appeared in his inbox. The subject line read, "Short Story Contest Results." Elijah's heart skipped a beat. "It's here," he whispered, his hand trembling slightly as he clicked to open the email. Danielle squeezed his shoulders as they both leaned forward to read. The first few words jumped out at them. "Congratulations. We are pleased to inform you." "I'm a finalist," Elijah exclaimed, jumping up from his chair. "Mom, I'm actually a finalist." Danielle wrapped him in a tight hug, tears of joy in her eyes. "I'm so proud of you, baby. So proud." Without even finishing his breakfast, Elijah rushed to Vivian's estate. Duke's excited barking announced his arrival before he could even ring the doorbell. "Elijah?" Vivian opened the door, concern crossing her face at his breathless appearance. "Is everything all right?" "I made it," he burst out, grinning from ear to ear. "I'm a finalist in the contest." Vivian's face lit up with joy. "Oh, Elijah, that's wonderful news." She ushered him inside, Duke dancing around their feet. "When's the ceremony?" "This Friday," Elijah replied, suddenly looking nervous again. I have to give a speech." "Well then," Vivian said with determination, "we'd better get you prepared. Come with me." They spent the afternoon in John's study, where Vivian helped Elijah craft his speech. She shared tips about public speaking while emphasizing the importance of staying authentic. "Remember," she said warmly, "they chose your story because of your unique voice. Don't try to be anyone else up there. Just be Elijah Turner." Standing before the study's large mirror, Elijah practiced his speech, adjusting his posture as Vivian suggested. His voice grew stronger with each attempt, his confidence building slowly but surely. "I'm ready for this," he whispered to his reflection, a mix of nervousness and excitement coursing through him. The grand ballroom sparkled with crystal chandeliers and polished marble floors. Elijah tugged at his collar, feeling like an imposter in the new suit Vivian had helped him choose. His reflection in the mirrored walls showed a young man trying his best to look confident, but his trembling hands betrayed his nerves. "You look wonderful," Vivian whispered, giving his arm a gentle squeeze as they made their way through the crowd. "Just remember to breathe." The room buzzed with conversation as literary figures, publishers, and fellow contestants mingled. Elijah noticed expensive watches glinting on wrists and designer shoes clicking across the floor. His own borrowed dress shoes felt stiff and uncomfortable. "I don't belong here," he muttered under his breath. Vivian turned to face him, her expression serious. "You earned your place here through talent and hard work. That matters more than anyone's fancy clothes or important connections." As they found their seats near the front, Elijah's phone buzzed with a text from his mother. "You've got this, baby. So proud of you." The simple message helped steady his racing heart. The ceremony began with a distinguished-looking woman approaching the podium. She spoke about the importance of fresh voices in literature and the remarkable quality of this year's submissions. Elijah barely heard her words over the pounding in his ears as she began announcing the finalists. "And the winner of this year's Young Writers' Prize goes to..." The woman paused, building suspense. "Elijah Turner, for his story, Bridges We Build." Time seemed to stop. Elijah sat frozen until Vivian's gentle nudge brought him back to reality. The room erupted in applause as he made his way to the stage, each step feeling both terrifying and surreal. Under the bright lights, Elijah gripped the podium and looked out at the sea of faces. His prepared speech forgotten, he spoke from his heart instead. "Thank you," he began, his voice growing stronger with each word. "This story wouldn't exist without two incredible women who believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself. My mom, Danielle Turner, who taught me that dreams are worth pursuing no matter the odds, and Vivian Marshall, who showed me that sometimes the most unexpected connections can change our lives forever. This award isn't just mine. It belongs to everyone who refuses to let circumstances define their future." The audience rose to their feet, applauding his words. Through tears of joy, Elijah caught Vivian's gaze in the crowd. She mouthed, "I'm proud of you." And in that moment, he felt truly accomplished. The evening air felt crisp and refreshing after the stuffiness of the ballroom, carrying with it the sweet scent of nearby flowering shrubs. Elijah and Vivian found a quiet spot near a decorative fountain, its gentle splashing providing a peaceful backdrop to their thoughts. The award certificate in Elijah's hands felt simultaneously heavy with responsibility and light with possibility, its golden seal catching the soft glow of the garden lights. "I still can't believe it," Elijah said softly, looking down at the elegant calligraphy spelling out his name, his finger tracing the elaborate loops. "Vivian, I need to thank you. Not just for tonight, but for everything. When we first met, I never thought..." His voice trailed off as he searched for the right words, his shoulders tensing slightly with emotion. Vivian waited patiently, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Without you pushing me, believing in me, I wouldn't have had the courage to enter this contest," he continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Even when I was angry or defensive, you didn't give up on me. You saw something in me that I couldn't see myself." Vivian dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, her usual composure slipping as she smiled through her tears. "Oh, Elijah," she said, her voice thick with emotion, You have no idea what helping you has meant to me. After John passed, I felt so lost, empty. But watching you grow, seeing your talent bloom, it's given me something I didn't even know I was missing. You've brought light back into my life." She took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts, smoothing her silk dress with trembling hands. "You taught me about humility, about really listening and connecting with others. I had to learn to see beyond my own privileged perspective, and that's been the most valuable lesson of all. You've helped me become a better person." Elijah nodded, understanding the weight of her words. The fountain's mist caught the light from nearby lampposts, creating tiny rainbows in the darkness. A gentle breeze rustled through the surrounding trees, carrying with it the distant sound of crickets. "You know," Vivian said thoughtfully, her composure returning gradually, "someday you could do this for someone else. Mentor younger writers, share your experiences. Your voice could inspire so many others who feel like their stories don't matter. You have such a gift for connecting with people through your words." "I'd like that," Elijah replied, considering the idea, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Maybe that's how we make real change. One story, one connection at a time. It's what you did for me, after all." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, letting the evening's events settle around them. The sounds of the ceremony could still be heard faintly through the building's walls. But out here, it felt like they were in their own peaceful bubble, protected by the darkness and the fountain's gentle song. "I think we make a pretty good team," Elijah said finally, clutching the certificate a little closer to his chest. Vivian smiled warmly, nodding in agreement, her eyes shining with pride and affection. "We certainly do." The morning sunlight streamed through the apartment windows as Elijah pushed open the front door, his heart still racing from the previous night's excitement. The framed certificate caught the light, making the gold lettering shimmer. In his other hand, he clutched the envelope containing the prize money. "Mom," he called out, his voice filled with anticipation. Danielle sat in their small living room, her face radiating joy. She'd been up most of the night, too excited to sleep, waiting to hear every detail of her son's triumph. "There's my writer," she said, standing up with arms outstretched. Elijah crossed the room in 3 quick steps, carefully setting down the certificate before falling into his mother's embrace. The familiar scent of her lavender lotion wrapped around him like a comfort blanket. "Look at this, Mom," he said, pulling back to show her the certificate. "They really liked my story. They said it was powerful and authentic." Danielle's eyes welled up as she traced the elegant lettering with her finger. "Of course they did, baby. You've always had such a beautiful way with words." They settled onto their worn couch, shoulders touching, as Elijah recounted every moment of the ceremony. His words tumbled out in excited bursts as he described the grand hall, the nervous anticipation before the announcement, and the surge of emotion when they called his name. "When I was up there, Mom," he said, his voice softening, "I kept thinking about all those late nights you worked double shifts so I could have a computer to write on. How you never once told me to give up on my dreams." Danielle wiped away tears, squeezing his hand. "Being your mother has been my greatest joy, Elijah. Watching you grow, seeing you push through every obstacle. You've made every sacrifice worth it." Elijah pulled out the prize money envelope. "I want to help with the bills, Mom. Maybe we can finally fix that leaky faucet in the kitchen, and I'll save some for writing classes too." "Oh, honey," Danielle said, her voice thick with emotion. She stood up, taking the certificate with careful hands. Walking to the most prominent spot in their living room, she hung it with pride. "This is just the beginning for you, my son." The afternoon sun cast dappled shadows through the estate's maple trees as Elijah and Vivian strolled along the winding garden path. Duke trotted ahead of them, his tail wagging as he investigated every flower and bush they passed. The sweet scent of blooming roses filled the air. "I've been thinking about writing something bigger," Elijah said, his hands moving animatedly as he spoke. "Not just short stories anymore, but a full novel." Vivian's eyes lit up with interest. "Tell me more about it." "Well, it's about this teenager who thinks he has his whole life figured out until something unexpected changes everything." Elijah paused to watch Duke sniff at a patch of lavender. "I want to show how sometimes the best things in life come from the most unlikely places." "That sounds wonderful," Vivian said softly. "You know, I've been doing some thinking of my own. I want to write John's story, and mine too, about how losing him shaped me, and how meeting you helped me see the world differently." Duke circled back to them, pressing against Elijah's leg as they walked. "Really? A memoir?" "Yes," Vivian nodded. "I think it's important to document not just the challenges we face, but how we grow through them. Your courage in sharing your writing has inspired me to share my own story." They stopped near a stone bench, and Duke flopped down at their feet, panting happily. "Maybe we could help each other," Elijah suggested. "Set deadlines, exchange drafts, give feedback, like real writing partners." "I'd love that," Vivian smiled. "We could meet weekly to review our progress. I could use someone to keep me accountable." Duke suddenly jumped up, chasing a butterfly that had caught his attention, making them both laugh. The moment of levity seemed to seal their agreement. As they reached the end of the garden path, Vivian turned to Elijah, her expression serious but kind. "Your story will inspire people far beyond what you can imagine." Elijah nodded, feeling both validated and inspired by her words. Elijah hunched over his desk, surrounded by a sea of crumpled paper, each one a discarded attempt at perfection. His trusty notebook lay open beside his laptop, its dog-eared pages filled with hastily scribbled character notes and plot points, arrows connecting various ideas. The afternoon sunlight streamed through his bedroom window, casting a warm glow over his workspace and highlighting the dust motes that danced in the air. He stared at the outline he'd created, his fingers hovering uncertainly over the keyboard. The basic structure was there, a story about transformation, unlikely friendships, and the power of believing in oneself. But as he began typing the first chapter, nagging doubts crept in like unwelcome guests, settling heavily in his stomach. "Would anyone even want to read this?" he muttered, running his hands through his hair in frustration, messing up the dark strands. The words on the screen seemed flat, lifeless, nothing like the vivid scenes playing in his mind. He deleted an entire paragraph, then immediately regretted it, his finger hovering over the undo button. His phone buzzed against the wooden desk. Vivian's name appeared on the screen. He answered, grateful for the interruption from his spiraling thoughts. "How's the writing going?" she asked warmly, her voice carrying that familiar mix of concern and encouragement. "Not great," Elijah admitted, leaning back in his chair with a creak. "I keep second-guessing everything. Maybe my experiences aren't interesting enough. Maybe no one will care about this story. It all feels so ordinary." "Stop right there." Vivian's voice was firm but gentle, like a teacher guiding a struggling student. "Your perspective is exactly what makes this story special. You're writing about real struggles, real growth. That's what connects with readers. Remember how your contest story touched people? This will too. You have a gift for finding the extraordinary in the ordinary." Elijah glanced at his framed certificate hanging on the wall, the golden seal catching the sunlight. "You really think so?" "I know so," Vivian replied with unwavering conviction. "Keep writing. Trust your voice. It's stronger than you realize." After hanging up, Elijah took a deep breath and turned back to his laptop. His fingers began moving across the keyboard, slowly at first, then picking up speed as the words flowed more freely, like a river breaking through a dam. He described his protagonist's fears, hopes, and determination with renewed confidence, pouring his own experiences into every sentence. 2 hours passed in a blur of focused writing, the only sounds in the room his steady typing and occasional murmurs as he read passages aloud. When he finally sat back to read over his work, a small smile crept across his face, satisfaction warming his chest. "This is just the beginning," he whispered, and for once the words felt true. The evening sun cast long shadows across Vivian's dining room as Elijah helped set the table. Fine china clinked softly against polished wood, while savory aromas wafted from the kitchen. Duke, usually bouncing around their feet begging for scraps, lay quietly in his bed near the window. "Duke seems a bit off tonight," Elijah noted, placing the last fork on the table. He walked over to the dog bed and knelt beside it. Duke's tail gave a weak thump, but he didn't lift his head. Vivian frowned, setting down the water pitcher. "He hasn't eaten much today. I thought he was just being picky." She joined Elijah by Duke's bed, touching the dog's forehead. "He feels warm." As they watched, Duke let out a small whimper and curled tighter into himself. Without hesitation, Vivian grabbed her car keys. "We should take him to Dr. Peterson. Better safe than sorry." The drive to the veterinary clinic was tense. Elijah sat in the back seat with Duke's head in his lap, gently stroking the dog's ears. Vivian kept glancing in the rearview mirror, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. "He'll be okay," Elijah said softly, though his voice trembled slightly. "He's tough." Dr. Peterson examined Duke thoroughly, while Vivian and Elijah waited anxiously. When she finally emerged from the examination room, her smile brought immediate relief. "It's just a mild stomach infection," she explained, writing out a prescription. "Nothing some antibiotics won't fix. Keep him on bland food for a few days and make sure he gets plenty of rest." On the drive home, Duke dozed in the back seat, the medicine already helping him feel more comfortable. Vivian wiped away a tear, her shoulders relaxing. "I was so scared," she admitted quietly. "Duke, he's all I had left after John passed. Well, until you came along." She glanced at Elijah with a warm smile. "You know, you've become like family to me. Both of you mean so much." Elijah felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I feel the same way," he replied softly. "You and Duke, you've changed my life in ways I never expected." Back at the estate, they settled Duke into his bed. Elijah sat cross-legged on the floor beside him, running gentle fingers through the dog's fur. Duke's breathing had evened out into peaceful sleep, his tail occasionally twitching with happy dreams. Vivian stood in the doorway, watching them with quiet gratitude, thankful for the unexpected family they'd become. The morning sun peeked through Elijah's bedroom window as he sat at his desk, fingers hovering over the keyboard. Steam rose from his coffee mug, and the familiar scent gave him courage. Today was the day. He would finish his novel. Hours passed in a blur of typing, deleting, and rewriting. Elijah barely noticed his mother leaving him a sandwich for lunch, too absorbed in bringing his story to its conclusion. When he finally typed the last word, he sat back in his chair, heart pounding. "Done," he whispered, almost afraid to believe it. His hand shook slightly as he hit the print button. The printer hummed to life, steadily producing page after page of his work. With the warm manuscript carefully tucked into his backpack, Elijah headed to Vivian's estate. His footsteps quickened as he approached the familiar gates. Duke's excited barking greeted him before he even reached the front door. Vivian opened the door with a bright smile. "Is that what I think it is?" she asked, eyeing his backpack. Elijah nodded, pulling out the manuscript. The complete first draft. They settled in the library, spreading the pages across the large oak table. Vivian read carefully, making notes in the margins with a red pen. Elijah watched her expressions change. Sometimes she smiled, other times her brow furrowed in concentration. Your character development is remarkable, Vivian said, looking up from a particularly emotional scene. The way you've captured their inner struggles. It's very authentic. As they worked through the manuscript together, Elijah found himself grateful for every suggestion, every thoughtful comment. This wasn't just about improving his writing anymore. It was about honoring the journey they'd shared. I couldn't have done this without you, Elijah admitted, his voice thick with emotion. Not just the writing part, but everything else too. You helped me believe in myself. Vivian reached across the table and squeezed his hand. You had it in you all along. Sometimes we just need someone to help us see it. Duke padded over and rested his head on Elijah's knee, as if adding his own seal of approval to the moment. The afternoon light filtered through the library windows, casting a warm glow over the scattered pages of Elijah's story. Their story in many ways. As the sun began to set, Elijah gathered the marked-up manuscript, carefully organizing the pages. Each note and suggestion felt like a stepping stone towards something greater. He said goodbye to Vivian and Duke, walking home under the dimming sky with his precious cargo tucked safely in his backpack. Elijah stared at his laptop screen, reading the email from the Youth Center director for the third time. His heart fluttered with a mix of excitement and nervousness. The invitation was unexpected. They wanted him to speak about his writing journey and recent contest win. He picked up his phone and called Vivian, who answered on the second ring. I just got this email, he said, his voice uncertain. They want me to speak at the youth center about writing and, well, everything. That's wonderful news! Vivian's enthusiasm was clear through the phone. You have so much to share, Elijah. Think about how many young people could benefit from hearing your story. But what if I mess up? What if they don't connect with what I'm saying? Just be honest, Vivian advised warmly. Share your truth. That's what people respond to most. At the youth center the following week, Elijah stood at the podium, taking in the sea of young faces before him. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the microphone. A few months ago, he began, I was just like many of you, someone with dreams but full of doubt about whether I deserved them. As he spoke about his journey, from saving Duke to winning the writing contest, Elijah noticed the audience leaning forward in their seats. He talked about self-doubt, about feeling out of place, and about finding strength through unexpected friendships. The biggest lesson I learned, he said, his voice growing stronger, is that your voice matters. Your stories matter. And sometimes the people who believe in you come from the most unexpected places. During the Q&A session, hands shot up across the room. One young girl asked about dealing with criticism. Another boy wanted to know how to start writing when everything seems overwhelming. Elijah answered each question thoughtfully, drawing from his own experiences. He caught sight of Vivian standing near the back of the room, smiling proudly. After the session, several students approached him to share their own writing dreams. One boy showed Elijah a worn notebook filled with story ideas, reminding him of his own treasured notebook. As they walked to the parking lot afterward, Vivian squeezed his shoulder gently. You're not just a writer. You're a role model, she said softly. Elijah smiled, feeling the truth of her words settle into his heart. His journey had become more than just his own story. It was now a beacon of hope for others. The phone's ring pierced the quiet evening air, startling Elijah from his homework. He picked it up with slightly trembling fingers, recognizing Vivian's number instantly on the screen. "Hello? Elijah!" Vivian's voice burst with excitement, nearly crackling through the speaker. "I just got off the phone with the publisher. They want your book." His hands began to shake so badly he had to grip the phone with both hands. "What? Are you serious? Really?" "Yes, they absolutely loved it. They said your voice is fresh and authentic, exactly what they've been looking for. They want to meet next week to discuss the contract details." Elijah sank into his desk chair, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. "I can't believe it," he whispered, running his free hand through his hair. Racing to the kitchen where Danielle was preparing dinner, the smell of garlic and herbs filling the air, Elijah could barely contain himself. Mom, the publisher accepted my book." Danielle dropped the wooden spoon she was holding with a clatter, turning to face him. Her eyes welled with tears as she pulled him into a tight embrace, the front of her apron dusted with flour. "My baby," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I always knew you could do it. Always." They sat at the worn kitchen table, memories flooding back. Late nights of writing, countless moments of doubt, drafts scattered across his desk like fallen leaves. Danielle reached across and squeezed his hand, her eyes shining with pride. "Remember when you used to write stories on the back of my grocery receipts? You'd fill every blank space with your tiny handwriting." Later that week, Vivian's estate buzzed with warmth and celebration. Soft jazz music played as guests mingled in the garden, the fairy lights twinkling in the early evening. Duke wandered between legs, tail wagging, soaking up attention from everyone who stopped to pet him. Jordan and Malik stood with Elijah near the fountain, playfully arguing about who would get the first signed copy of his book. Danielle clinked her glass with a silver spoon, drawing everyone's attention. Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke, emotion making the words catch. When Elijah was little, he would tell stories to anyone who would listen. Even the mailman had to hear about his latest adventure. But it wasn't until Vivian came into our lives that he found someone who could help shape that raw talent into something extraordinary. She turned to Vivian, tears glistening. "Thank you for believing in my son, for seeing what I always saw in him." Laughter and conversation filled the evening air, mixing with the chirping of crickets. Friends shared memories, family members hugged, and Duke dozed contentedly under the buffet table, occasionally lifting his head to check on his humans. As the party began to wind down, Vivian pulled Elijah aside near the garden roses, their sweet fragrance filling the air. "This is just the start of something incredible," she said softly, squeezing his shoulder. Elijah nodded, his heart full of gratitude as he looked around at the people who had supported his journey, each one playing a crucial role in making his dream come true. Elijah's fingers trembled as he traced the embossed letters on his novel's cover, lingering over each carefully crafted word. The weight of the book in his hands felt both familiar and surreal, like a dream made solid. Sunlight streamed through his bedroom window, catching the golden letters of the title and making them shimmer with promise. At the local bookstore, chairs filled quickly with eager readers, the excited murmur of conversation filling the air. Elijah sat behind a table stacked with copies of his book, his heart racing beneath his crisp button-down shirt. The store's warm lighting and wooden shelves created a cozy atmosphere, the scent of fresh coffee and new books mingling together. But his hand still shook slightly as he uncapped his pen and smoothed down the signing page. "Your story really touched me," said a young girl, sliding her copy across the table, her eyes bright with emotion. "I never thought someone like me could be a writer. You changed that." Elijah smiled warmly, remembering his own past doubts. "That's exactly why I wrote it. to show that our voices matter, every single one of them. Person after person approached, sharing their connections to his words, each interaction more meaningful than the last. Some spoke of their own dreams, others of obstacles they'd overcome. Each conversation strengthened Elijah's sense of purpose, filling his heart with quiet joy. From the back of the store, Vivian watched proudly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears as Duke sat contentedly at her feet, his tail thumping against the hardwood floor. When the line finally dwindled, she approached the table, carrying a hardbound book of her own, its cover gleaming under the lights. "I thought it was fitting to give you this today," she said softly, handing him her memoir, her fingers brushing his. "You inspired me to tell my story too, to be brave enough to share it." Elijah opened the cover, finding her elegant handwriting inside, the ink still fresh and dark. "To Elijah, who taught me that second chances can change lives. With love, Vivian." Later that evening, Elijah stood in his room, holding both books, his novel and Vivian's memoir. He placed them side by side on his bookshelf, their spines aligned perfectly, two different stories connected by trust and transformation. "We did it together," he whispered, taking in the sight of their shared accomplishment, feeling the weight of their journey in every word. The evening breeze carried the sweet scent of blooming jasmine across Vivian's expansive porch, mingling with the subtle fragrance of her prized rose garden. Elijah leaned back in his wicker chair, watching the sun paint golden streaks across the sky, feeling more at peace than he'd ever imagined possible. Beside him, Danielle and Vivian sat comfortably in their usual spots, while Duke dozed peacefully at their feet, his gray muzzle twitching occasionally in his dreams. "It's hard to believe it all started with this little troublemaker running into traffic," Vivian mused, reaching down to scratch Duke's ears. The dog's tail thumped contentedly against the wooden planks, creating a gentle rhythm that matched the peaceful moment. "Sometimes the best things in life come from unexpected moments," Danielle said, her eyes twinkling as she gazed at her son with unmistakable pride. "Like watching my boy become a published author. Who would have thought that morning would change everything?" Elijah smiled, thinking about the stack of reader letters on his desk at home, each one a testament to how his words had touched someone's life. "I've been thinking about my next book," he shared, his voice filled with quiet confidence that had grown stronger with each passing day. "I want to explore themes of resilience and redemption, show how people can grow through their struggles, just like we did." "Speaking of growth," Vivian interjected, straightening in her chair with renewed purpose, "I've decided to donate part of my memoir's proceeds to start a literacy program. Your story showed me how important it is to give others a chance to find their voice. Every child deserves that opportunity." "That's wonderful, Vivian," Danielle beamed, reaching over to squeeze her friend's hand. "You know, watching Elijah these past months has been like seeing a flower bloom. He's living proof of what faith and hard work can achieve. And now you're helping others do the same." Elijah ducked his head, touched by his mother's words and the warmth of their shared bond. The sunset cast long shadows across the porch as they sat together, comfortable in their shared silence. Duke shifted in his sleep, sighing contentedly, his presence a reminder of how their unlikely family came to be. "This is what family feels like," Vivian said softly, her words carrying on the evening air, weighted with emotion and gratitude. Elijah and Danielle nodded, their hearts full as they watched the sun paint the sky in brilliant shades of gold and pink, its rays catching the wind chimes that tinkled softly above. In that moment, surrounded by love and understanding, they were exactly where they needed to be. Three souls brought together by chance, bound now by something far stronger than circumstance. If you enjoyed the story of Elijah, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.